Americans for Prosperity North Dakota proudly supported important policy improvements that broke barriers for all North Dakotans this legislative session. From tackling unnecessary and burdensome occupational licensing standards to fighting for tax relief, AFP is proud to have played a part in improving the lives of North Dakotans this year. Join AFP today by visiting www.afpnd.org. This advertisement was paid for by Americans for Prosperity. Senator Kevin Cramer joins me now, just back from visiting our southern border with our neighbors to the south, Mexico. Kevin, you just got back into Bismarck this morning? Is that what you were telling me?
Well, it was early this morning because of delayed flights last night and, hopping a couple of airlines. But I did get back, so I'm in Bismarck now.
What did you see?
Well, I actually saw a lot. I went to El Paso. First of all, it's one of the busiest crossings in the country, both legal and illegal. It's got a very, very busy, what they call a port of entry where legal immigration takes place, and frankly, some illegal. By the way, for example, we saw a car torn apart that crossed that yesterday morning with a bunch of. We were able to watch that process. But anyway, I went there because there's a lot of it, and it's real close proximity to each other. So I saw a port of entry complete with both a customs operation and a border patrol operation. Of course, they are two agencies within the Customs and Border Protection. I spent a lot of time, probably the most time, at an ICE detention facility, which was very impressive. And then I went out with Border Patrol to a wall. So there's a mile, 1.3 miles of relatively new wall built in 2017. I think it took over a year. But anyway, and that it's a wall that sort of goes up against a mountain that's pretty well-known area. And that was interesting because it was built by the Corps of Engineers, or at least overseen by the Corps of Engineers. It's a very different sort of looking wall than what we're used to seeing on the news. But then when I was done looking at that, I went to the other side of that mountain on some private land where the We Build the Wall segment is. And the common denominator from the Customs and Border Protection folks was that both sides had worked very well. It's funneled all of the illegal traffic, at least the traffic that sort of tries to cross the border wherever they want, it's sort of into a choke point right up against that particular mountain, which makes life a lot easier for Border Patrol. So that's what I saw, and I talked to private, landowners as well as, of course, a lot of law enforcement folks. Like I said, ICE, Customs, and Border Patrol, and was thoroughly impressed by the work that they do.
How do you feel about there's so much focus on the border wall, and we have a question from a listener who's going to ask you about a Washington Post report, talking about President Trump, reportedly willing to take some pretty extraordinary measures to get the wall built. There's so much focus on the wall, and I've always felt I support a border wall. People should not be crossing our southern border illegally. We want them to cross legally at the proper points and do so in a way that allows us to care for the people coming across and make sure that their rights are protected and all of those good things. But to me, the wall is part of the solution. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve the problem. Did you hear, other than the wall, did you hear anything down there about what else we need to do? I mean, obviously this is not a new issue, but are we making progress in other areas to address the problem with illegal crossings?
Rob, I'm glad you asked the question because the most common thing I heard. So for example, the question I always ask, whether it's a patrol officer on the boots on the ground, member of the administration of the Border Patrol, Customs, and the ICE. They all said the biggest thing Congress can do for them, the most important thing Congress can do for them, is change the policies that attract illegal immigration in the first place. And especially the Flores Agreement, and I think your listeners probably as familiar as anybody with that, asylum laws. We just have such very liberal and frankly pretty confusing rules and regulations. And so the president just last week, I think it was, or quite recently anyway, was trying to change the Flores Agreement. The Flores Agreement was a settlement between the government and a young woman, a 15-year-old named Flores, whose last name was Flores. I think it was Jenny Flores, several decades ago. And it was agreed to by the Supreme Court, but it was meant to be temporary. And it deals with, of course, that issue of child separation and how long you can detain an unaccompanied minor or a minor, separated from their parents. And how you, by the way, and how you, of course, detain them, even if it's only for 20 days or per the agreement. But nobody's really codified the Flores Agreement, and nor have they come up with a better idea, a better permanent law. And so that's really what I heard the most often, Rob, even from the cops on the beat. It was, we need to change our policy that attracts people here, first of all. And then the second thing really probably was the wall, that the wall, at least in that area, has made a tremendous difference in their ability to patrol. Remembering that all of these agencies have different roles, although they're all pretty well cross-trained, and including in the art of changing diapers and feeding babies, unfortunately. But the Border Patrol itself, who's the tip of the spear, the wall really helps them, not by eliminating crossings altogether, but by sort of funneling, if you will, crossings, and by what they like to say is seconds to minutes, minutes to hours. In other words, a wall just makes it a lot longer for somebody to get across and then escape into the middle of the country, because it gives them plenty of time. Here's the third thing, interestingly, by the way, and I saw this very up close, of course. President Trump's recent arrangement with the federal government in Mexico has made a world of difference. And I saw several federal officials, mostly National Guard members from Mexico, along their side of the border, which, of course, serves as another deterrent for Mexicans, for people coming across that border. They have a similar presence, of course, on their southern border, which is very significant. So are we making some progress? Well, we are, because that particular crossing I was at has had as many as 1,500 to 1,800 detainments a day coming across, and there were very, very few when I was there. In fact, the ones that I saw were mostly people who had tried to cross illegally, have an asylum claim, were detained in Mexico, and then scheduled for their court hearings, and they were coming across at their scheduled time for their scheduled court hearing, their scheduled asylum hearing. So the combination of things has made a big difference just in recent weeks. The problem is none of it's really sustainable, because you never know when Mexico is going to stop enforcing on their side, or whether we have to continue to, issue threats of tariffs or whatever brings them to the table. And it's, our own laws haven't been changed permanently. We don't know whether President Trump's executive order on Flores, the Flores replacement will hold up or not. And so Congress still has a lot of work to do.
Let me. I want to get to a listener question. Linda asks: Is he in favor of Trump directing government agencies and individuals to commit crimes? Those are her words. To commit crimes in order to get this wall built in time for the 2020 election, and that the president said he would pardon them for any crimes committed in the process. To just go ahead and take the land without due process. How is this acceptable from any president whose oath of office is literally to uphold the laws of the country? Now, I believe she's referring to a Washington Post report that came out yesterday evening. They're quoting President Trump as saying, take the land. Don't worry, I'll pardon you, saying these stuff. This is a quote, again, attributed to an unnamed former Trump administration official. Quote, he said people expected him to build a wall and it had to be done by the election. Now, I don't think the idea that, President Trump obviously campaigned in 2006 in part on building a border wall. It doesn't surprise me at all that he's feeling some political pressure to build the wall. And as a matter of fact, that's the way our system works, right? Like, do what you said you were going to do, or you're not going to get reelected. So, I don't have a problem with any of that. Some of that stuff, though, here in North Dakota, we talk a lot about property rights. When we're talking about the abilities of farmers to farm, ranchers to ranch, oil production, oil companies to go out there and do their thing. Property rights are an important thing here in North Dakota. To hear President Trump saying reportedly take the land. Does that concern you at all?
Well, it does if I believed it. A couple of things. The Washington Post, and I was quoted in that story, as you know, fairly prominently, but I'm the only person that's anything's attributed to in that story. And I've been in probably the last 3 Washington Post stories on the wall. And in all of those stories, the Washington Post quotes unnamed sources. And at some point, you would think that the Washington Post could name somebody or come up with something better than quote unnamed sources, and then report hearsay as though it's real. Now, would he say something like that in a meeting with a bunch of people? I could easily see him saying certain things like that and not meaning them, or he's, as we know, he's very flippant. He's very jocular, if you will, in a lot of situations. The concept of every word matters when you're the president sometimes eludes him. But I don't. It's hard for me to imagine Donald Trump ever saying something seriously as an order to somebody like that. And if he did, by the way, he could be in a lot of trouble. But considering that the Washington Post has yet to place a name or attribute anything, anybody to any of these things, it just makes me kind of cringe at the idea that they're a serious newspaper. But I continue to answer their questions about my role in all of it. I would say this: the president's frustration is clearly understandable. The slow pace that this is taking place is very frustrating to him, I'm sure. But I do think, and as you know, I often am critical of the Corps of Engineers, and if I talk long enough, I will be again. But the one thing the Corps of Engineers is really, has an expertise in is land acquisition, where you need to acquire land. In some places, in what's known as the Roosevelt easement, for example, there's several hundred miles that federal government already has, and a lot of the wall will be or is being built there along the Rio Grande. But there are other areas where land needs to be acquired, or in one fashion or another. In some cases, perhaps a condemnation process takes place, and that's where the Corps' real estate expertise really does come in. But it's hard for me to imagine that the president ever seriously suggested that somebody just go ahead and break the law and pardon them. Although I can imagine him saying it and not meaning it literally.
Do you, obviously this situation you're going, if we get to a point where the federal government is, acquiring land in ways that do not respect, due process and the condemnation process
Sure.
that we have, is that a point at which you would step in and say, hey, I want to build a wall, but not this way?
Absolutely. But I also know that the Corps of Engineers is really good at that due process, which leads to condemnation. I'll give you just an example. In El Paso, where I was, I talked about the mountain. And so there's 1.3 miles on the west the west side of the mountain, and there's another whatever it is, half mile or so on the east side that goes up against the mountain, and the mountain then serves as the last barrier. It's about a mile actually between those two fences, and the one being built on private land, the other one being built, it was also on private land but acquired. So that mountain is largely owned by the Catholic diocese. Well, one can only imagine, and by the way, it's a bit of a pilgrimage area. It's got a beautiful cross at the very top of it, and it's very important to the Catholic diocese in El Paso. Well, part of building the rest of that wall would require acquiring land from the diocese, who's not inclined to do it. They're very pro-immigration. So that's why that's not been built there. It may not ever get built there. It may get built there. Maybe condemnation is the very thing that the Catholic diocese wants, because then it sort of clears their conscience, if you will. I'm just thinking out loud. But all of that said, there's the standard of due process, Rob, and you and I can talk about lots of things. And by the way, even that is questionable to me. Find any way possible to avoid even due process, because the reason for private property rights and why private property is such an integral part of our heritage, not just constitutionally but even pre-Constitution and to our founders, is because it's part of our private property and private property ownership. It's what makes us more free than anybody else. So even in the occasion where the government needs to use the process of a taking, it ought to be very, very rare.
I want to read a question from Ron. He says, "What's with his stunt at the border, not in his district?" So I think his question essentially is, you're senator from North Dakota. Why did you feel the need to go to the southern border and take a tour?
Well, because I'm a United States senator, and senators don't have districts, and so Ron may be a little confused about the two houses, the chambers, the two chambers, the House and the Senate. So the House of Representatives has a district. It just so happens in North Dakota, it's the whole state. But nearly every senator has been to the border, and now including me. And it's a good thing we do go there because we pass laws and spend money, appropriate money, based on the challenges around the country. In fact, when the founders created the Senate, they did it specifically for that purpose, so that senators would be looking out. They'd be the statesmen, if you will, whereas the People's House was more the political body that looks out for their particular 700,000, constituents. So the founders actually designed it to be that way. But remember, I just came back from Japan and Singapore and in Australia and Fiji, where I was meeting with defense ministers and trade ministers from around the world on behalf of national defense and trade policy in the United States Senate. When the Senate has trade ratification, or all kinds of ratification authority, and not to mention advise and consent authority over who runs our military and all kinds of things. It's really important for senators to have those on the ground experiences. Not unimportant, by the way, for House members either. The squad, if you might recall, made a visit to that very same place I was yesterday at El Paso, and they pulled off quite a stunt, pretending that detainees were drinking out of toilets and didn't have toothbrushes, and just demeaning.
Well, let's talk about that. What did you see of that? I mean, did you see the conditions that any detainees were living in? What were your thoughts? If you did, what were your thoughts?
Well, it was. I'm incredibly impressed with the work of Border Patrol, Customs, ICE. I mean, there's an ICE detention facility in El Paso that's been there since mid-1960s. There's been one attempted escape, and that was about 12 years ago. It's clean. They're well fed. They're taken care of. They have clean water. Now, when there's 1,800 of them in a facility that's designed for a couple of hundred, the ability of Border Patrol to find ways to shelter those people, put up tents, make sure they have health care, clean water, 3 meals a day, shelter, not only just tent shelter, but then in one case, for example, one of the stories you heard was that they were relegating people to being, living under a bridge. Well, yeah, there's a big bridge that is the border crossing itself. That's the port of entry, and that bridge provides incredible shelter opportunity right there on the border during the storm. And so what they did is they put some tents under that particular bridge to keep people safe. There's drinking water out of the toilet. You heard about that crazy stunt. Well, there's no drinking water out of the toilet. There's a drinking fountain right behind the toilet. Lots of people use it, including, by the way, Senator Tim Kaine, a Democrat, as you know, former vice presidential candidate, did that on a recent trip down there. So, no, I'm so impressed with the way people are taken care of. And if they weren't, why would they come? I mean, when you think about it, these are people voluntarily breaking our laws, coming into our country illegally. And why would they do that if they were going to be abused when they got here by our own government? In many cases, they're abused after they get into the center of the country, particularly children. And we heard lots of awful stories about that, where the traffickers literally are not just the people that bring them across the border, and are promised a very large sum of money to do it, but then their partners are the sponsors who then get these children in the interior of the United States oftentimes and use them to again to gain that money back that they're promised for helping them cross the border. So it's really a tragedy. But no, I don't consider it a stunt at all for members of Congress to go down and be as well informed as they can on major policy before they make major decisions.
Andy asks via Facebook, I would like to know if Senator Kramer will discuss the nomination for Judge Hovland's Article 3 judgeship. Specifically, I would like to know who he supports and why, and whether he believes it should be an attorney for Western North Dakota as opposed to somebody from the East. Also, in light of retired Supreme Court Justice Mary Maring's Call, it's Marring is how he spelled it. Call for more female judges to Senator Kramer. Support any female candidates for the judgeship. I'm not familiar with that call for more female judges, but your thoughts.
Yeah, she was, of course, a state Supreme Court judge, and I'm trying to think if any female lawyers or attorneys expressed an interest in the federal judgeship to replace Judge Hovland. I don't believe there were any. All the names and faces are sort of going through my brain right now, and I'm not coming up with a female. I might be wrong, but I don't remember any that did apply. And my interest is just the best possible candidate. I think they ought to be a North Dakotan, for sure. Where they live in North Dakota, I guess I'm not overly concerned about. Just so people know, that the reason the person asked the question is because Judge Hovland, who's the current judge in Bismarck, has announced his intention to go on what's called senior status. And in the judiciary, senior status is sort of retirement. And I say sort of because some of our judges in senior status work very hard, and we appreciate that they do that because we need them. It's such a heavy load. So senior status just means it opens up that judgeship for a new appointee. There will be a new judge nominated, maybe even later today. It's very, very close to being done. There's been background checks have been worked on and have been done, in fact, on one candidate. And I'm not going to say who it is. There may be some folks out there that have been interviewed by the FBI on his behalf, but I'm going to wait for the White House to make that announcement. But I think in the next, hopefully within the next few hours or next few days anyway, there'll be some sort of an announcement on who would fill that. The nice thing about that is I think, Rob, and I don't remember the exact date of Judge Hovland's departure or senior status, but it's in October or November.
I want to say it was in like towards the end of October. I want to say, if I'm remembering right.
So if we say November 1, for example, I don't know that we could get somebody through the Judiciary Committee and to the floor that quickly. We'll see. But the judgeship in Fargo was vacant for a long time, and what we wanted to avoid that again. We don't want a long vacancy because there's a really high demand right now for cases in North Dakota. So I'm hoping within a few days, and then hopefully we can expedite it in the Senate and get it done before the end of the year. It'd be great.
That's all I got for today, Kevin. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thanks, Rob.